Hi guys, Steven here from Techtesters and welcome back to our channel. And today we're going to be taking a look at the first RTX cards that we got in. Now we're not going to look at the RTX 2080 and 2080 Ti as far as the chipset goes. We'll have a separate video to talk about the performance of the chipset compared to previous generations, talk about ray tracing and DLSS and all the other stuff that's interesting for this generation. But for this video we're going to assume that you know the basics and you just want to learn more about these Asus cards in particular, either because you want to buy one or because you just like finding out how good or how bad their cooler is. Now the moment we take these cards out of the box, it feels like Asus is off to a good start because they're just damn impressive cards to look at. I mean, it's entirely subjective, but it's really hard not to like them. I really like the 10 series, for example, and it just feels like they've taken the 20 series just a little bit further. So it's a bit thicker and some of the details are a bit nicer. So for example, before we still had the silver colored metal back, which is now painted black as well. The die cast, which is supposed to hold the card straight, just looks a little bit nicer. Everything has just been improved a little bit. We'll say the same for the fans, which now have little edges going around them. Again, it's entirely subjective, and I know it's primarily made to be to make the cooling more efficient, but it just gives this card a next generation feel. It's also black with some gray details, so it's something that easily combines with a bunch of motherboards, which is something that we generally appreciate building a lot of PCs. Now, them being larger cards, it definitely helps to look more impressive, and especially if you have a slightly larger case where you really want your GPU to shine, it's great, but it does make compatibility something to consider. It being about 2 centimeters taller than the standard card means you need a bit of space as far as the depth of your case goes. Usually it's 30 centimeters for the RTX 2080, it's 30.5 centimeters for the RTX 2080 Ti, so they're fairly long cards. Actually, the cooling solution is exactly the same, it's just on the Ti it's slightly offset. Aside from that, it's really hard to tell them apart, although if you do look closely, you'll see that the RTX 2080 has 2 fan connectors, which you can use to connect case fans to, and the RTX 2080 Ti does not. It's interesting to note that it's not just a bigger GPU because of a large cooling solution, it actually has a custom PCB which is taller. Now they did that because they wanted to add extra extra phases to the VRAMs over the reference design. And the reference design has already been beefed up from the last generation as far as power supply goes, so this is should prove to be a fairly solid design. Generally speaking, more phases means a higher efficiency and lower temperatures, so we're definitely looking forward to how that's going to work out. And obviously, it being an ROG card, it's kind of hard to not talk about the RGB. It has RGB on the backplate, it has an RGB logo on the front side, so it's kind of hard to miss. And it's going to have RGB lighting up on the edges of the fan. So that's pretty similar to last generation. What is, however, new and is quite interesting for people that really think RGB is just a gimmick, they've now added a little button here on the backplate, which you can just use to turn it on and off. So the RGB haters out there are going to definitely appreciate that feature. So let's talk performance, and we'll talk about the RTX 2080 first. It is ridiculous. I mean, we expected a factory overclock, but it actually overclocks to 1965 megahertz automatically. And it's not just doing that in the first minute or two after running a benchmark, which is what some cards do, which really skews certain reviews and benchmark results. But what we do is we let it run for like 20-30 minutes first, and it evens out at 1965, which is a great factory overclock. But more importantly, it comes in at 54 degrees Celsius stable in a 23 degrees Celsius environment, which is ridiculously cool. Well, if we go back 1 or 2 generations, we had cards idling at around 50 degrees, and now we have a next generation card that's roughly 1080 Ti performance at its base level, running at 54C, while running 37.5 decibels at 40 centimeters, which is barely audible. More importantly, however, is that even though it's running a little bit faster, so about 2% in most benchmarks, it is actually slightly more power efficient as well. So this one is running about 5 watts lower than the comparative Gigabyte, which is kind of supposedly credited to the better VRM design. Now, as for the RTX 2080 Ti from Asus, well, this one pulls about 100 watts more from the socket, so this is definitely going to run a bit warmer and make a bit more sound. However, it still does fantastically well. So this one clocks or stabilizes its clocks at 1950 megahertz, which is again a fantastic factory overclock. And it's doing that at 62 Celsius and 40.1 decibels at 50 centimeters, which is an objectively stellar performance. Now, quick note about power consumption in general. If you're looking to buy an RX 2080, we generally see it doing about 250 to 300 watts when we combine it with an i7-8700K. That means that any decent high quality 550 watt power supply, assuming it has the 2x8 pin this card needs, should be fine. It gives you a little bit of OC headroom as well. For the 2080 Ti, we'll say look at something like a 650 watt, because this one does generally peak every once in a while towards the 450 marker. If you go far, keep in mind overclocking an i7 can really drain power, so you might want to go a bit higher if you're into excessive overclocking. But again, 550 watts for an RTX 2080, 650 watts for an RTX 2080 Ti is a good place to start with. So there's one interesting thing when we're talking about noise and cooling, etc. Now what they've added this time around is they add a little BIOS switch that allows you to swap from the standard performance mode, which is the performance numbers I just gave you, to a quiet mode for people who think that the standard mode is still not quiet enough. Now on the RTX 2080 first, what happens is when we hit the switch, it actually went from 54, which we started with, to 66 degrees Celsius, which is, you know, a fairly big delta. On one hand, it's 12 degrees more, but at the same time, 66 Celsius on a fairly high-end GPU is, in absolute terms, a fantastic temperature still. Unfortunately, what happened is that the noise production only went down by about 1 decibel. It's a fairly small difference for 12 degrees loss. What we do think is that if you start overclocking and pushing it a bit more, that gap will grow a bit, but I cannot say I'm overly fond of the option on this one, and I would say just leave it on the performance mode, considering it's already super quiet under load. Now when we look at the quiet mode on the RTX 2080 Ti, that's actually where the difference becomes a little bit larger, because this one was doing 40 decibels before, and in the quiet mode is doing 37. Now going down from 40 to 37 makes the difference between I can hear my PC is running, and you actually have to pay attention to hear if it is so. So quiet freaks out there are definitely going to appreciate this option. It does, however, again come at a cost in temperatures, because the standard 62 it was running on is now gone up to 75, which is still a perfectly acceptable temperature to run a high-end GPU at, but it is a significant increase. Now what we would recommend is, generally speaking, is you leave it on the performance mode, because the cards are already more efficient and already quieter than last year, so the chances of you actually being bothered by the sound this makes are fairly slim. Now that basically sums it up for these two for the time being. Don't forget to check out our RTX content if you want to learn more about the performance of the chips in comparisons and so on. Just in absolute terms, these results are fantastic. They overclock well, they're exceptionally cool, they're exceptionally quiet, and we seriously doubt that any competitor is gonna really beat this. Something is probably gonna get close for less money, because that's the ROG thing, where we basically expect these cards to be slightly more expensive than the competition. Even though we don't know anything about pricing yet, it's basically been like that year after year with ROG, which kind of makes sense because we haven't seen a single bad thing to say about those cards. So generally speaking, that means that they're going to be more expensive. So if you cannot wait for a comparison, and if you're literally just wondering, I want an RTX now, I want an RTX 2080 Ti now, is the Asus one awesome? It absolutely is. Anyway guys, that's it for now. We hope you enjoyed and liked this video. Give us a like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to see more, and see you in the next one. Bye bye.